thank you all for coming tonight. And I'd like to especially thank Mary Jo Van Gerpen, who put all of this together, and who also was co-chair of our caucus. So Mary Jo, thank you for that. Okay. So before we start tonight, I want to put a plug in for another event. Next Thursday, a week from tomorrow, we're going to have a dance party at the Alley downtown that the band Cornmash has volunteered to do a fundraiser for us. So please come on down and dance and donate a little to the party so we can pay for our office and stuff this week. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Fischer, who's going to teach us how to write letters to the editor. And I think many of you know that Jim was the editorial writer at the Tribune for many years, and he edited an awful lot of letters to the editor, and I think knows what is fairly convincing to do. So, Jim?
Thanks, Dave. I did this same thing 2 years ago, but I did throw my notes away. but I don't think anybody aside from Dave was foolish enough to come the second time. So you'll have to hear some of the same things, I think. And I'm planning to talk with you more than talk at you. So consider just some opening remarks by way of trying to provoke you. The first thing I'll start with is whether anyone should write a letter to the editor of a newspaper. And I think the answer is yes. And to give a good reason for why, I'm going to turn to a much better writer than I to kind of explain its role in a democratic government. This is from E.B. White, well known for his children's books, Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little, but also one of the writers who made the New Yorker what it was and what it still is. And he's quite a fine writer. In 1943, during World War II, he got a call from the Writers' War Board asking him to write a statement on, quote, the meaning of democracy. And this is his response. Surely the board knows what democracy is. It is the line that forms on the right. It is the don't in don't shove. It is the hole in the stuffed shirt through which the sawdust slowly trickles. It is the dent in the high hat. Democracy is the recurrent suspicion that more than half of the people are right more than half of the time. It is the feeling of privacy in the voting booths, the feeling of communion in the libraries, the feeling of vitality everywhere. Democracy is the letter to the editor. Democracy is the score at the beginning of the ninth. It is an idea which hasn't been disproved yet, a song, the words of which have not gone bad. It's the mustard on the hot dog and the cream in the rationed coffee. Democracy is a request from a war board in the middle of a morning, in the middle of a war, wanting to know what democracy is. So I think that by writing a letter to the editor, like voting, is one of the highest callings of the American sovereign, which is, of course, the citizen. And letters, for that reason, are not only worthwhile for the person writing them, but they can also be very worthwhile for political campaigns. People who run campaigns like to talk about free media or earned media, they call it, as opposed to the stuff they have to buy, the ads that they have to pay for. And almost every candidate, of course, is looking for some way to get more free media or earned media. And letters to the editor, of course, are a good avenue to that. And I think that's one of the reasons why the local Democratic Party wants to have a gathering like this, so to encourage people to write them. Another thing about letters is, and something I know from my experience at the Tribune of editing and dealing not only with the letters, but also with the people who write them and the people who read them for more than 20 years, is that the letters column is one of the best read parts of the newspaper. And that's, of course, a little deflating to the ego of somebody like me, but I invariably heard that people were more likely to read the letters that appeared under the editorials that I wrote than the editorials themselves. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that they're a little shorter and they're easier to dip in and out of. Another thing is that these are actually written by people voluntarily. I was being paid to write editorials. These are things that people are doing on their own, and therefore I think they're of a little more interest to their fellow citizens. And also because they have people's names on them. And I think that, I know from writing editorials which we signed, if only by initials, we never at the Tribune made any secret of who JF was or BH was or MT now. Readers like to have targets, and they like to know who's responsible for something. And I know when the Spokesman Review, which experimented for a while with signed editorials, went back to unsigned editorials, they got a lot of flack from their readers, because readers like to know who's writing something. They don't like something that's anonymous. And the traditional reason for most newspaper editorials to be anonymous is that they are a product of an editorial board rather than any particular person. And a board sits and decides what it wants to say, and then the writer just goes away as pretty much a technician. And the editorial is the product of a committee. Unfortunately, a lot of editorials read as if they were written by committee. They're not very lively, and they don't have a lot of personality to them. There's one caveat, though, to the business about letters when it comes to election letters, and I found from visiting with people, election letters are a lot less popular than other letters to the editor. And I always had people around election season tell me, oh, it's those damn election letters, I hate seeing those things all the time. And I think part of that is because the pages start to get burdened with so many letters toward the end of a campaign. But also, a lot of election letters aren't very interesting. A lot of them deal with cliches, and we'll get around to that in a little bit, talking about kind of the substance of the letters. So, if someone wants to write a letter, I think the first question that probably occurs is, when should a letter be submitted? And of course, we have an election coming up now. We've already passed the primary. You can send a letter to the editor at any time. And people wonder, well, should I send one now? Should I wait until just before the election? My judgment is that you should send one when you want to. You should send one when you've got something to say. I don't necessarily think there's a reason to wait. And writing one early can't hurt, but writing one late actually can. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If you're writing one late, and I used to see this every year, people wait until the deadline day at the paper for letters to come in, and people would come in with sheafs of letters. And they would invariably be quite long, and by that time I would usually be condensing them down to a very, very small amount, a sentence or two, little short paragraphs. And I would see the same people do this year after year after year, and I always kind of tended to wonder about the mental faculties of these people. They didn't learn anything from the last election, that they would do the same exact thing again. But that was because I worked at a paper where we actually tried to run every letter we got. As long as we didn't have a good reason not to, we tried to run everyone. The Spokesman Review is not such a paper. It picks and chooses, so you can't be guaranteed that when you submit a letter that it will appear. But at the same time, you are much more likely to see more of your letter appear if it comes in early rather than late when there's a big flood of letters. The counter to that, of course, is that during the summer months like this, people think, well, nobody's paying too much attention to electoral campaigns, and they're not really going to start paying attention until after Labor Day, so we should probably wait and do it then. And I think there might be some truth to that, but that's also when the number of election letters increases and people's eyes start to glaze over when it comes to letters. So, and the other thing is that most papers do have a limit on how frequently you can submit a letter, but there's no reason, if you wrote one now, for example, you couldn't write another one in July, another one in August. You know, usually the limit on frequency at the Tribune, it was every other week. So you would have a chance to submit quite a few. But of course you don't want to submit several at the same time because you're not going to see them all appear. And again, I would see people do that too. They would come in and they would have one letter endorsing so-and-so, another one endorsing so-and-so, and they'd split them all up and not realize that you can't submit a shotgun array of letters at the same time and expect them all to appear. Some papers that do choose don't edit quite as much, but at the Tribune, the letters policy always says letters are always subject to condensation, and the condensation, which meant essentially just editing, got more and more severe as the election came around, and it was a real headache for me having to try to fit some more trying to fit some more letters into a page where I only had a finite amount of space. And I think that the finite amount of space, of course, is growing smaller at papers as papers get more pinched financially. So I think you really need to think about the space that's available. Summer is a slow time. If you want to see a letter with some length and some substance appear, summer is a good time, and you know, there are still people reading the paper. During the recent presidential campaign, I've heard a number of people say that talking about the economy's effect on the outcome, they say that the economic state actually in about June is what is more determinative of how the presidential race will come down than what happens just before the election. People kind of things start to gel in their minds a little earlier. So I think there's no reason not to start writing a letter as early as possible. Next question is, how long should a letter be? And here, as with time, you need to observe the paper's own limitations. And almost every paper has a length limit on letters. The Tribune, I think it's still 250 words. I think the Spokesman Review is 200 words. I don't know about the Daily News, but I would advise people never to go over that limit, because those limits are usually adhered to pretty strictly, and you know, I've always found that I had a knack for taking out people's best points, because they because they always told me that. So and so I always told them, well, if you don't want me to take out your best points, maybe you ought to
make them obvious.
Get rid of some of the lesser ones yourself. So
if you think all your points are the best points,
yeah.
Where do you start?
There's another reason for being careful about length, and that is that the shorter letters get more attention than the longer ones. Everybody has shorter attention span these days, and it's the same with me. When I look at letters to the editor, I see one like that. I'm going to look at that one before I see one that goes over into a second column. So if you can possibly do something very quickly and concisely, I think you can make a better point than if you really go on. Another thing that people should remember is that journalists work according to what's called the inverted pyramid, which means that when you write a news story, when a reporter writes a news story, the most important thing is supposed to start come at the very beginning, and then it's supposed to get less important as it goes down through the story. And the reason for that is that everybody's work is subject to editing, and when editors come after those stories later, they generally cut from the bottom. So saving a punchline for the very end of a letter to the editor is probably not a good idea, because that might be your best point, and it might not appear. I would, on occasion, get letters that almost defied editing. Oftentimes because they told a story, a linear story. And what are you going to do with somebody who starts off with this thing and then goes like that? Well, what I had to do was I had to edit them. And did that mean those stories generally ended up looking pretty ragged? Yeah, it did. But that was my job, and I didn't really have a lot of choice about it because I was under instructions from the publisher that this was going to be the length limit on letters. So you really need to consider that and remember the inverted pyramid and not save your best point till the very end because you probably will lose it.
Jim, when you say edit the letters, is it always because of the length, or is there something in there that you take out?
Well, the only papers have different policies on that. Some papers are more squeamish about some things than others. We had a very light hand on letters at the Tribune, and the only thing that I would remove for reasons other than length were libel, which of course we didn't want to go to court over a letter to the editor. So anything that was even looked potentially libelous, I would remove. And then strong language, which is kind of a sliding standard. There are things that appear now that wouldn't in the past, but generally those are the kind of things.
Give me an example of libelous, something that's libelous.
Oh, for example, calling one of the candidates a crook.
Even though it's true?
Well, if it's convicted. If someone has been convicted, you can call them a crook. But even if someone stands accused, but no, you can't do that. I taught journalism for a couple of years, and I would tell students that you can call somebody a jerk from here until Sunday, but if you call somebody a crook, you better be able to back it up. And so those kind of things.
Alleged? Does alleged work?
No. No, it doesn't. No, there's an interesting lawsuit being litigated right now up in the Coeur d'Alene, Spokane area, where newspapers now, the Tribune and the Spokesman Review included, have electronic messages that people can submit, and they are not mediated, at least when they first appear, and that opens the possibility for libel to appear. And I've seen it appear many times in the Tribune, and I had a continuing argument with my publisher about the wisdom of doing that. I didn't think that should be permitted. But the legal view of that now is that as long as you are not mediating the discussion, you are not responsible for it, even though you are the paper whose website these things are appearing in. I suspect that's something that the law is not very well decided on, and we might see the law change. But there's I think she's somebody involved in Coeur d'Alene city government, or county government.
The chair of the Republican Party.
But she's an official of some kind in government.
Yeah, she is.
And somebody accused her of embezzlement. If I remember right. Yeah. And she is suing, and the Spokesman Review has gone to court saying, "But gee, we're not to blame. We're not responsible for this." That's a hard one for me to wrap my head around. And I always told my publisher, I said, well, your lawyer might say that, and some other lawyers might say that, but I'd hate like hell to go before a jury with an argument like that. Because if I were a juror, I would say, yes, that paper's responsible for publishing that.
What about the idea that public figures can be libeled, but private people can't?
Well, theoretically they can't be libeled, but it is much, much harder for a public figure to prove libel than it is for someone else. Anybody who becomes a public figure, either through being a public official or by inserting himself or herself into public debates or something like that, has to meet a higher standard. It goes back to the old New York Times versus Sullivan case. And for a public figure to prove that he has been libeled, has to demonstrate that the person who published the falsehood did so either knowing it to be false or with reckless disregard for its truth or falseness. And whereas just any ordinary person who is libeled in a paper can sue and does not have to prove that. All he has to prove is that it was false. Public figures generally avoid filing lawsuits because it is so hard.
So talk radio doesn't run under these rules then?
A lot of things appear on talk radio that really surprise me. And I don't know that they are under any different law than newspapers are, but for some reason they act as if they are, and a lot of them get away with things that are really quite remarkable to me. And you know, I would get calls from our lawyer sometimes and reminding me of the law when he would see something in a letter to the editor. And it's for newspapers, because newspapers tend to be pretty careful about the law. It's usually the little things that it isn't some big expose. The big exposés they have pretty much nailed down. It's always some little thing that appears that gets them in trouble. And letters to the editor can be one of those things. I tried to be careful about those things, but sometimes Chuck would notice things that I hadn't, and he'd give me a call and remind me. We'll get into that a little bit more later. I'm going to talk about the difference between going negative and going dirty. But first, I think we should probably talk a little bit about just the substance of a letter itself. And as I said, election letters tend to be less popular than regular letters, and I think that one reason for that is that so many of them are so predictable, and they deal in cliches, especially the ones that you tend to see just before an election. Which almost sound as if they are, ground out by party hacks working in some basement someplace. And you start to see the same expressions over and over and over. And I've got just a short list here of some words that I would avoid at all costs in a letter. Dedicated, hardworking, caring, patriotic, community-oriented. Those are the things that I think make people's eyes glaze over as the election draws near, because not only because they're kind of trite in their own right, but also because they appear in so damn many letters. You see them all the time. It's like when I used to interview candidates for public office, and this would be especially people who were running for offices, community offices or something like that, more than people in higher office. And I would ask, well, why are you running? And they would say, oh, this community has been so good to me, I just wanted to give something back to it. And then I would say, what? And they go, huh? And I'd say, well, what do you want to give back? What do you want to do? And almost always somebody who said that didn't have the first idea. It was, Bill Hall used to tell me about how, he would always ask candidates that, if I were elected, I would, and go like this, and then people would sit there with a blank face. And he said when Cecil Andrus first ran for governor, he said that to Cecil Andrus, and Cecil said, I would put kindergarten in Idaho schools, I would do this, I would do that, and he actually had a list. Those are the kind of candidates who really catch on. As opposed to just people who are saying that they're running because they're such good-hearted, dedicated people. So I think that the letter that's really going to get attention is something that has something different to say about someone, something specific, something particular. This person. I'm supporting this person not just because he's dedicated, but I'm supporting this person because this is what he wants to do. This is what she has already proposed. That kind of thing. This is the change that this candidate is promising. One other thing that is a weakness in many letters: if you are responding to something that has already appeared. Whether it's something in a letter to the editor, whether it's in a news story, whether it's been in an editorial or something like that, don't assume that people know what you're talking about. They almost never do. You say, so-and-so says on, June 9th that such says, or in response to the letter that appeared last Thursday, and then just come out with this stuff, and people will say, what letter was that? And you're going to lose them right there. So you need to make clear what it was that you're responding to. In other words, synopsize what it is that you're responding to.
Jim, can I ask a question?
It
seems to me very often that when people are responding to an allegation in the paper, that the way they respond to it doubles the effect of the initial charge because they repeat it.
Well, but you can't get away from it, Steve. I mean, you need to let the readers know what you're talking about. You could say, in response to the phony charge of such and such or something like that. But you still need to do it. If you think the charge is damaging enough that it doesn't bear repeating, maybe you should just shut up.
Well, but all the political books I've read is never allow a charge to go unanswered because silence implies guilt. You can't not respond.
Yeah.
But to repeat it is to double the insult in a sense. So I mean, there's sort of a dilemma there.
But of course, if you're responding immediately after the fact, so everybody has that in their brain and everything, that's one thing. But I'm talking about a letter to the editor, maybe responding to another letter or something like that.
Yeah.
So.
Well, couldn't you just say, I'm responding to Skip Brand's lies because somebody has to answer for them, and then stop with that, and then go on and...
Well, as long as people know what you're talking about. If they know which lies you're talking about.
Well, it would be a couple of
The other issue is so far I've been talking about letters endorsing somebody, speaking for someone, and then of course we all are familiar with letters that don't do that letters that go after somebody, go negative in other words. And I don't necessarily think there's anything the matter with that, with criticizing someone, as long as you're not sleazy. And there's a big difference. I think that candidates especially have to be negative if they say, suppose a challenger is taking on an incumbent. It's very hard, I think, for a challenger to campaign against an incumbent without saying something negative about the incumbent, because you have to give voters a reason why they should vote for you as opposed to the person who's already in office. And you can be very critical of someone without crossing a line of going into something dishonest or unfactual. I think that anybody who resorts to that kind of thing deserves condemnation, which means that I think most political campaigns these days deserve condemnation, because unfortunately we see almost all campaigns, at least on the national level, do it. And I think it's really shameful. I see the Obama campaign doing it now. Of course, I see the Romney campaign doing it, and I think it's a shame. And I'm surprised that voters are as tolerant of it as they are.
Could I ask a question on that subject? If you're writing a letter to the editor and you'd really like to point out that somebody is a Tea Party member and they're not willing to admit it out loud, but everybody knows, how do you do that without coming across like you're really negative or nasty or something?
You just say that so and so espouses Tea Party ideals. You know, how can you tell this person from someone in the Tea Party when they're saying exactly the same thing? I don't see anything wrong with that. I will caution, however, that some papers, as I said, are more squeamish about these things than others. The editorial policy at the Tri-City Herald, I don't know if it's still the case, but their policy used to say, letters that attack groups or individuals will not be published. And I asked their editorial page editor one time, how can you have any fun if you can't attack groups or individuals? You end up with a pretty arid page if you're not going to do that kind of thing. And at the Tribune, we would err on the other side, if anything, including publishing letters that were blatantly racist. The Spokesman Review, Doug Floyd at the Spokesman Review tells me that racist letters are the first things that go in the trash can at his place. And I said, oh, we publish them. We think people deserve to know what's out there. And I think that it's healthy for the community to see that kind of thing. And then the community also kind of polices itself when that happens. Bill Hall told me about an incident that predated my arrival at the Tribune. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, somebody in Clarkston wrote a letter asking, and of course he was assassinated when he was in Memphis for a garbage worker strike, and somebody wrote a letter just asking, how could they bury King when the garbage workers were on strike? And the paper published the letter, caught all kinds of hell for publishing the letter, but then sure enough, all these letters started pouring in, coming back at this guy who had written this thing. And as I talk about the self-policing nature of the column, and I think it was, I still think it was the right decision to do it. And I published many letters, maybe not quite as concise and pointed as that, but I published racist letters when I was in charge of them. And I did so with the publisher's knowledge and approval.
Don't you think too, if you say something is beyond the pale, then you're really inserting your own bias into, I know there are letters that I thought were terrible that you might not have felt were all that bad. Remember Frank O. Jacks?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, he used to write these
Speaking
horrible
of
letters
Clarkston.
about women, you know. and I think it would have been a shame not to publish them because some of us had a lot of fun writing letters back, you know. So yeah, I don't know. I think the community character needs to be displayed with all of its warts.
I think so too. I think that's, you know, when you start sanitizing the public discussion, also the question is where you're going to stop.
Yeah.
That's a really tough line to draw.
So hate speech is out.
Hate speech is in the letters to the
I
editor.
understand, but the laws against hate speech is out as far as you're concerned.
Well, if you're talking about the legal notion of hate speech, that's probably another matter. But I think that there were occasions when letters would veer over toward direct threats, where then a line had been crossed, and then those kind of things would not appear. And oftentimes, just a libel would appear in a letter, and you know, a lot of ordinary people are not very familiar with libel law, and I would be able to just edit a libelous reference out. Although if the sole intent of a letter was to libel somebody, then the letter probably wouldn't appear.
It almost sounds as if there are boundaries with respect to individuals, but there's no boundary with respect to society. You can say as hateful a thing in a societal context as you want, but if you target an individual, that's crossing the line. It seems to me hate speech is saying you can also libel the group as a whole.
Yeah, and I think that's a facet of the law that is probably changing, like privacy law. I mean, it's really hard for journalists to find out where the line is on privacy law right now, because it's really in flux in different courts around the country. Whereas libel law is definitely easier. There's a clearer line there. I also think that